The horse arrived riderless at the edge of Coldwater Creek on a Tuesday morning in late October of 1878, and that was the first sign Charles Watkins had that the day was going to pull him sideways from every intention he had ever made for himself. He had been nursing his second cup of coffee on the porch of Abe Holly's boarding house, watching the flat amber light come across the scrubland and making quiet calculations in his head. 3 more months. Maybe 4, if the passes hardened early with ice. He had stacked enough from his work at the Rafter Tea Ranch to buy passage north by rail from Amarillo, and from there he intended to find his way to Colorado, where a man named Garrett Fulton had promised him a partnership in a silver operation outside of Leadville. It was not the most romantic of plans, but Charles Watkins had learned somewhere between his 28th and 29th birthdays that romance was a luxury that a man with no family land and no inherited name could ill afford. He was 31 now, lean and sun-darkened, with a jaw that had taken one too many bad turns and eyes the particular shade of brown that people sometimes called honest. He kept his plans simple. Work until spring, leave the territory, do not look back. Then the riderless horse appeared. It was a bay mare, well kept despite the foam crusted along her neck, and she stopped at the water trough beside the road and drank with the desperate urgency of an animal that had been running hard and long. Charles set down his cup. He noticed the side saddle first, then the small leather satchel tied to it, and then the long smear of something dark across the left stirrup leather that made his stomach tighten. He rose without hurrying, because a man who hurried at every strange sight in the New Mexico territory was a man who spent his life in a state of constant alarm and walked down the 3 porch steps and across the dust toward the mare. She let him approach without flinching, which told him she was accustomed to people and not badly treated. He checked the satchel. Inside was a small Bible with a name written on the inside cover in neat, careful script: Beatrice Wainwright, Coldwater Creek, NM Territory, 1878. He looked down the road in both directions. Nothing moved except a dust devil spinning lazily near the old mill foundation. He saddled his own horse, a gray gelding he called Pepper, and rode in the direction the mare had most likely come from, which was west along the creek road, judging by the dried mud on her hooves. He found her about 2 miles out, sitting against a juniper tree with her left arm held carefully across her chest and her hat gone, and her dark hair fallen loose around her shoulders. She was perhaps 25 or 26, with a face that was composed even in its pain, which told him something about the kind of woman she was. She looked up at him with eyes that were a very clear hazel, almost green in the morning light, and said with admirable directness that she had fallen when her mare shied at a rattlesnake and that she believed her wrist was broken. "Can you ride?" he asked. "I can do most things," she said. "I simply prefer not to do them while my wrist is grinding against itself like a millstone." He dismounted and looked at the wrist without touching it and agreed with her assessment. He helped her up onto Pepper, which she managed with a dignity that impressed him despite himself, and led both horses back toward town with her seated in his saddle and him walking at the gelding's head. She did not apologize for the inconvenience. He noted that too. Her name was Beatrice Wainwright, as the Bible had told him, and she had come to Coldwater Creek 4 months earlier from Missouri to take the position of schoolteacher after the previous teacher, a young man named Elroy Sims, had decided that the territory was not, in fact, the adventure he had imagined and gone back east on the first available stage. Beatrice had come because her father had died the previous winter, leaving her the single practical option of finding employment in a place that was still desperate enough for educated people to welcome a woman in the position. She told him this in a straightforward manner, as though she were presenting facts rather than a history, and he listened without interrupting, which she seemed to appreciate. He brought her to the doctor, a tired man named Caldwell who had once practiced in Santa Fe and now practiced in Coldwater Creek because, as he often said, the territory had a way of keeping hold of people. Caldwell set the wrist and splinted it and told Beatrice Wainwright to rest it for 6 weeks and to use her left hand for nothing heavier than a cup of water. She thanked him with genuine courtesy and then asked Charles Watkins what she owed him for the trouble. He shook his head. Nothing. A man doesn't walk 2 miles in boot leather on flat rock for nothing, she said. Consider it a neighborly instinct, he said. I'll retrieve your mare from the trough and bring her to the livery. He did this, and he thought about Beatrice Wainwright perhaps twice more before he went to bed that night, and both times he set the thought aside with reasonable firmness. He had plans: Colorado, spring, silver mines, and a clean slate north of here. He did not see her again for 10 days, and when he did it was because the roof of the schoolhouse had developed a leak during a hard November rain, and old Walt Prout at the hardware store mentioned it over a game of checkers, and said that the schoolteacher was trying to teach arithmetic in a room with a bucket in the middle of it, and wasn't that a shame? Charles was no carpenter by training, but he had repaired enough ranch structures to know his way around a hammer and shingles, and he found himself at the schoolhouse on a Saturday morning, with no clear explanation for why he was there, except that the leak bothered him in some abstract civic way. He heard her before he saw her. She was inside, reading aloud to herself in a clear and unhurried voice, and it took him a moment to realize she was practicing the following week's reading lesson. He knocked on the door frame. She appeared in the doorway with a book under her good arm and her splinted wrist held carefully at her side, and she looked at him with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite expectation, but something balanced carefully between the two. "Mr. Watkins," she said. "I heard about your roof," he said. "Word travels effectively in this town," she said. "It's a small town," he said. He spent the better part of that Saturday on the schoolhouse roof while she worked inside below him, and occasionally she would come to the door and hand up a cup of water, and once she handed up a slice of bread with butter on it, because she said that a man doing physical labor on a cold morning without something in his stomach was likely to be irritable and imprecise with a hammer, and she preferred her roof fixed properly to her roof fixed quickly. He ate the bread and said nothing about how it was the best bread he had eaten since leaving his mother's house in Tennessee 8 years ago, because that felt like more information than the situation required. When he came down, she paid him in cash from a small tin box she kept on the teacher's desk, and she counted it out with her right hand because the left was splinted, and she counted it precisely, and she looked him in the eye when she handed it to him. "Thank you," she said. "I mean that genuinely." "It was just a roof," he said. "Nothing is ever just a thing," she said. He walked back to the boarding house and sat on the porch with his coffee and thought about that sentence longer than was probably wise. November deepened. The territory turned cold in the way that high desert turns cold, not with the soft gray blanketing of eastern winters, but with a sharp, crystalline quality that made the stars look like shards of ice flung across black velvet. Charles worked at the rafter tea through the week, riding fence lines and bringing in the last of the stray cattle from the far pastures, and on weekends he began to find reasons to be in town. He told himself it was because Abe Holly's boarding house had better food than the ranch bunkhouse, which was true. He told himself it was because he needed to be close to the telegraph office for word from Garrett Fulton in Leadville, which was partially true. He did not tell himself it had anything to do with Beatrice Wainwright, because he was a man who preferred his self-deceptions to be at least structurally plausible. He saw her at the general store on a Friday afternoon in mid-November, trying to carry a sack of flour with one arm while her splinted wrist hung at her side. He took the flour without being asked and carried it to the small house the school board had provided her, which was a tidy 2-room structure behind the schoolhouse with a vegetable garden that had gone to frost, but still showed the evidence of considerable care and effort in the arrangement of its beds. She invited him in for coffee. He accepted. Her house was simple and carefully ordered. She had brought books from Missouri, a considerable number of them, and they were arranged on shelves she had constructed herself from boards and bricks. She had a good cast-iron stove and a table with 2 chairs, and a braided rug on the floor that she said her mother had made before the cholera took her in 1869. She said this matter-of-factly, not for sympathy, just as information, as though she were annotating the physical contents of the room. Charles found that he could not decide if this quality of hers was armor or simply character, and he suspected it was both. They talked for 2 hours. About Missouri and Tennessee, both of them having come from a different country in some essential sense, the thick-haired green places of the Middle South and border states, and ending up here in this vast dry territory where the sky was enormous and the distances between people were not merely physical. About books. She read widely and without snobbery, moving easily between a novel by Henry James, which she had strong and articulate opinions about, and a penny dreadful about a fictional outlaw that she admitted she found enormously entertaining despite its many historical inaccuracies. Charles had not talked to a woman like this in years, not since he was young and his older sister Clara had sat across the kitchen table in the evenings and argued with him about everything and made him feel that his thoughts were worth the air they displaced. He left before dark and walked back to the boarding house thinking about things he had not thought about in a long time. He wrote to Garrett Fulton the following week, asking whether the partnership terms would hold until late spring or even early summer. Fulton's reply came back in just under 2 weeks, confirming that the terms were flexible, that the operation would not be at full capacity until the mountain passes cleared anyway, and that Charles was welcome any time before June. Charles folded the letter and put it in his coat pocket and told himself that this changed nothing. He was still leaving. He was simply leaving with a small adjustment to the timeline. December arrived with its short days and long evenings, and the town of Coldwater Creek settled into the particular rhythm of a frontier community in winter, quieter and closer, and more aware of itself. The saloon, the trading post run by a man named Hector Vega who had been born in Chihuahua and knew the territory better than anyone alive, the small Catholic church at the south end of town, the school, the handful of houses and businesses that constituted the whole of what anyone had agreed to call a community out here in the enormous nothing of the territory. Hector Vega had a daughter named Rosario, who was 11 years old and had been falling behind in her reading, and he asked Charles one evening, somewhat shyly for a man who was ordinarily the most confident person in any room, whether Charles thought the schoolteacher might be willing to give Rosario extra lessons. Charles said he had no idea but that he would ask. He asked Beatrice the following Sunday when she walked past the boarding house after church, her dark coat buttoned to the throat and her splint recently removed, the wrist healed clean according to Dr. Caldwell. Beatrice said yes immediately and without negotiation. "Bring her Thursday after school," she said. Charles delivered this message to Hector, who was visibly grateful in the quietly emotional way of fathers who want things for their daughters that the world has not always been generous about providing. Charles knew that Mexican families in the territory occupied a complicated and often unjust position, welcomed when labor was needed and dismissed when it was not. Their children sometimes explicitly excluded from formal schooling by community prejudice if not official policy. He knew that Beatrice had not excluded Rosario or any of the other Mexican and mixed heritage children from her classroom, and he knew that this had caused some grumbling among certain members of the town who had specific ideas about who education was for. He respected her for not negotiating with those ideas. He kept this respect to himself. On Thursday, he found himself walking past the schoolhouse at the time when Rosario's lesson was supposed to be ending, just to see if Hector needed company on the walk to retrieve his daughter, and he arrived to find Rosario and Beatrice both bent over a book at the table, the child reading slowly and carefully and Beatrice listening, with the absolute focused attention of someone who understood that a child's reading voice was the sound of a mind opening. and that you did not interrupt such a sound with corrections but with encouragement. He waited outside. When Rosario came out, she was carrying a small book that Beatrice had loaned her, a simple illustrated volume with large print, and she held it against her chest with both arms the way children hold things they intend to keep. Beatrice appeared in the doorway behind her. "She is going to be an excellent reader," Beatrice said. She just needed someone to slow down and listen to her, rather than pushing her forward before she was ready. Charles walked Rosario home through the cold early dark, with the stars coming out overhead and the child chattering about what she had read, and he thought about patience, and about the particular human gift of knowing when not to push, and he thought about Beatrice Wainwright with a warmth that he had to acknowledge was no longer simply admiration. He was developing feelings for her. He acknowledged this privately on a Wednesday in the middle of December, sitting on his bunk at the boarding house while the wind rattled the window in its frame. He acknowledged it the way he acknowledged a bill that needed paying, with a practical resignation rather than any dramatic emotion. The feelings were there. He had them. They were inconvenient. He was leaving in the spring. He also acknowledged that she might not have any corresponding feelings whatsoever, which was a reasonable possibility, and which he held on to as a useful counterbalance to what was happening in his chest, whenever she turned that clear hazel-green gaze on him and spoke to him as though his opinion were a thing worth having. Christmas came to Coldwater Creek with a modest celebration that included a church service, a community supper organized by the women of the town in the feed barn behind the trading post, and a small exchange of gifts among the adults that was less about the objects given and more about the acknowledgement of one another's continued existence in this particular stretch of difficult country. Charles gave Hector Vega a good bottle of rye whiskey and received in return a tin of Hector's wife's tamales, which were extraordinary. He gave Abe Holly a wool muffler he had bought from the dry goods shop, because Abe was always cold and always saying so. He had spent 3 separate occasions standing in front of the small selection of goods at the dry goods counter, debating what to give Beatrice, which told him quite a lot about his mental state that he preferred not to examine directly. He settled on a small journal with a good clasp and pages that were not the thin, poor-quality kind but thick and cream-colored and pleasant to write on, because she had mentioned once in passing that she kept a journal, but that her current one was nearly full. He left it on the step of her house with a card that said simply, "From Charles Watkins," and then immediately felt that this was either the right thing or a profoundly embarrassing thing and could not determine which. She found him on Christmas afternoon at the community supper and thanked him with a directness that short-circuited his anxiety entirely. "It is exactly right," she said. "I have been rationing the last pages of my old journal for 3 weeks. How did you know?" "You mentioned it," he said. "You were listening," she said, and the way she said it was not an accusation but an acknowledgement of something she had noticed and valued, and he felt it in the center of his chest like a hand pressed gently against a door that had been closed for a long time. She had given him a book. It was a volume of poetry by Walt Whitman, The Leaves of Grass, the 1867 edition, and she had written on the inside cover in the same neat script from her Bible, "For someone who walks 2 miles on flat rock because it is the right thing to do. Beatrice Wainwright." He read the book cover to cover over the following week. He had not read much poetry since school, and he had been skeptical, but Whitman moved him in ways he had not anticipated: the celebration of the ordinary world, the democratic embrace of all kinds of human experience, the voice that spoke directly and without condescension about what it felt like to be alive and present in a complicated world. He read particular passages several times. He did not tell anyone this. January of 1879 arrived and brought with it a series of circumstances that would, in retrospect, make it impossible for Charles Watkins to pretend any longer that he was maintaining an appropriate emotional distance from Beatrice Wainwright. It began with a man named Foster Klein. Klein had come to the territory from somewhere unspecified, traveling alone and presenting himself at first as a land buyer, which was a common enough cover story for any number of different purposes in the territory. He was perhaps 35, with a square, handsome face and a manner that was charming in the way that certain things that are designed to be charming tend to be charming, smoothly and without imperfection, which was itself the warning sign. He stayed at Abe Holly's boarding house, which was how Charles came to observe him, and he observed with the quiet attention that years of working in unfamiliar places among unfamiliar people had given him. Klein took an interest in Beatrice Wainwright. He brought this interest to the surface in stages, first making inquiries about her at the boarding house, asking Abe in a casual tone about the schoolteacher, whether she was married or widowed or spoken for, what kind of family she came from. Abe answered these questions because Abe was a sociable man who did not think about the intent behind questions until after he had already answered them, and Charles listened from his corner of the parlor with a quiet that was not quite stillness. Then Klein began to appear where Beatrice was. He attended the small Sunday services where he had not attended before. He found reasons to visit the general store when she was there. He was always polite, always at a proper distance, always operating within the boundaries of acceptable social conduct, which made it impossible to object to without sounding unreasonable. Charles understood this technique from the ground up, and it made him deeply uneasy. He also understood that he had absolutely no claim on Beatrice Wainwright's time or attention, that she was a free woman who could talk to anyone she chose, and that his unease had no legitimate outlet except his own private unease. Then Hector Vega took Charles aside one evening in January and told him something that changed the character of the situation considerably. Hector had contacts throughout the territory, built over 20 years of trading and relationship building, with every community from the ranching operations to the Pueblo settlements to the freight companies. And one of these contacts had sent word that a man matching Foster Klein's description had worked a confidence scheme in Las Cruces the previous year, specifically targeting a widow woman who had inherited her husband's land claim and had no one to advise her in the legal complexities, and that the woman had lost her claim and her savings both before anyone understood what had happened. Klein was a predator who specialized in women alone. Charles thanked Hector and went home and sat with this information for one evening, weighing it against his own sense of what was appropriate and what was not, and in the morning he walked to Beatrice's house and knocked on the door. She answered in her teaching dress with chalk dust on her right sleeve, because she had been preparing the blackboard for the school day, and she looked at him with an inquiring expression that said she could see from his face that this was a serious visit. He told her about Klein. He told her what Hector had learned, presenting it clearly and without embellishment, and he told her he thought she should know because it was information that was relevant to her situation as a woman living alone in a community where she had not yet had time to build the full network of relationships that would ordinarily protect her. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Do you believe this information to be reliable?" she asked. "Hector Vega has never given me inaccurate information," he said, "and his sources are better than most." "Then I am grateful you told me," she said. I had already noted something uncomfortable in Mr. Klein's approach, but I lacked the specific context to name it. "What will you do?" he asked. "I will be precisely polite and entirely unavailable," she said. "I have managed men with inappropriate intentions before. It is an unfortunate skill that women are required to develop, but I have developed it." He nodded. Then, because it felt like it needed to be said, he said, "If he gives you any real trouble, I want you to send word to me, directly." She looked at him for a moment with that clear gaze that he was beginning to understand saw considerably more than it revealed. "All right," she said, "I will." Klein was persistent for about 3 weeks, and then Hector Vega had a quiet conversation with him at the trading post, during which no voices were raised and no threats were made, but during which certain realities of the territory were explained in terms that Klein found sufficiently clear. And Klein left Coldwater Creek on a Tuesday morning in late January on the southbound stage and was not seen again. Charles thought afterward that the whole episode might actually have been a kind of gift to him, because something had shifted between himself and Beatrice in the telling and in the aftermath. A wall had come down that had not been a wall he had built deliberately, but was more like the natural reserve that exists between two people who have not yet declared themselves to each other, and who are both too careful to declare before they are certain. He had shown her that he was watching for her well-being not out of presumption or possession, but out of genuine care for her as a person. She had shown him that she received care gracefully and without diminishment. These were things worth knowing about each other. February came in, cold and dry, and the territory in February had a spare, honest beauty that required a certain kind of person to appreciate. All bare rock and winter grass, an enormous sky without the softening of leaf or flower. Charles had begun taking Sunday afternoons at Beatrice's house, which had become established by mutual unspoken agreement as something he did, in the same organic way that the roof repair and the flower carrying had happened, not because either of them had proposed it, but because it had simply started happening and neither of them had stopped it. They talked about everything. This was the most remarkable thing, Charles thought, about being in her company. They talked about the books she was teaching the children and the books she was reading herself. They talked about Tennessee and Missouri and what they had left there, the specific textures of those places, the particular quality of green in a Missouri summer versus a Tennessee summer. They talked about the territory, its history, its complexity, the way the land had passed through Spanish, and then Mexican, and then American hands in ways that were often ugly and unjust, the displacement of the Pueblo peoples and the Apache, the complicated positions of families like Hector's who existed in the overlapping zones of different cultures and different claims. Beatrice had thought carefully about these things in ways that Charles admired, without romanticizing them or simplifying them, looking at the injustice directly and calling it what it was while also acknowledging the full humanness of everyone involved. He told her about Colorado. He told her about Garrett Fulton and the silver operation and the plan that he had been carrying since the previous summer. He told her because it felt dishonest not to, and because honesty with her had become something he was not willing to compromise. She listened to this without any change of expression, and then she said, "That sounds like a good plan." "It is a practical plan," he said. "Those are often the same thing," she said. "Are they?" he said. She looked at him steadily. "Not always," she admitted. There was a silence between them that was not empty but full, weighted with things that neither of them had yet said and that both of them were aware of not saying. Then she asked him if he would like more coffee, and he said yes, and she rose to pour it, and the moment passed and neither of them pursued it further, not that day. He went back to the boarding house that evening and sat at the small desk in his room and wrote a long letter that he never sent to his sister Clara in Tennessee, describing what had happened to him in the past 3 months in more honest terms than he had managed with himself, until he saw them written out in his own handwriting on the page. He described Beatrice Wainwright. He described the quality of her mind and the directness of her manner, and the way she held her ground in a world that did not consistently honor women who held their ground. He described the feeling of sitting across a table from her and knowing that he was in the presence of someone who was genuinely herself, without pretension or performance, and how rare and valuable that was. He described how he felt when he was not with her, which was a low, steady awareness of her absence, like a note playing beneath all the other sounds of his day. He folded the letter. He set it under his Bible. He went to sleep. In the morning, he rode to the rafter tee for his shift and worked the full day without speaking much, which the other ranch hands attributed to cold weather and accepted without comment because men in the territory did not typically require explanation for a colleague's silence. The second week of February brought an unexpected snowfall, the first significant one of the winter, which covered the mesa and the creek, and the town in 8 inches of quiet white and transformed Coldwater Creek into something that looked like a painting of itself. Schools were suspended for 2 days. The boarding house filled with the smell of wood smoke and cooking. Charles saddled Pepper and rode a loop around the town's perimeter in the morning to confirm that the road was passable and to check on a few elderly residents who might need assistance with firewood, which was something he had done the previous winter without anyone asking him and which had become an informal expectation in the community since. He stopped at Beatrice's house. Her path had not been cleared. He cleared it. Then he knocked. She appeared, wearing a heavy shawl over her dress and carrying a mug, and she looked at the cleared path and then at him. "You did not have to do that," she said. "I was clearing paths," he said. "Yours was on the route." She looked at him again with that gaze that saw more than it revealed. "Come inside," she said. "I have made oatmeal." He tied Pepper and went inside and ate oatmeal by her stove while the snow continued beyond the window, and they talked for most of the morning. And at some point between a conversation about the philosophy of John Stuart Mill, which she had been reading, and a conversation about the best way to cook a rabbit, which he had opinions about from years of necessity, he reached across the table and took her hand. He was not planning to do it. It happened in the way that things happen when a person has been holding something carefully for too long, and their grip finally opens. Her right hand was lying on the table beside her mug, and he covered it with his, and he felt her go very still. He looked at her. She was looking at their hands. "Beatrice," he said. "I know," she said quietly. "I don't know how to explain it," he said. "You don't need to explain it," she said. "I know exactly what it is. I have known for some time." "The Colorado plan," he began, "is a plan," she said. "Plans change." She looked up at him then, and her eyes were the clearest, most direct things he had ever seen. "They change when there is sufficient reason for them to change." "Is there sufficient reason?" he asked, and he was aware of how much weight he was putting into those words, the weight of Colorado and Garrett Fulton and 3 months of carefully maintained intentions. She turned her hand under his and held it. "I think there might be," she said, "but I am not a woman who commits to that statement quickly. I want you to know that." "I know that," he said. "I have watched you," she said, "for months. The way you are with Rosario. The way you were with the situation with Klein, telling me directly instead of handling it around me as though I were something fragile. The way you fix roofs and clear paths without announcement. I have been watching all of it." "And," he said. "And I think you are a good man," she said. "And I think good men are rarer than silver deposits in Colorado, and I think I would be a fool not to acknowledge that clearly." He laughed, unexpectedly, a short, warm laugh that surprised him, and she smiled, which was its own specific revelation, because when Beatrice Wainwright smiled it transformed her face entirely, pushing warmth into every line of it. They sat like that by her stove while the snow fell outside, and it was not the conclusion of anything but the beginning, and both of them understood it that way. The snow melted over the next week, and the territory returned to its winter normal, and Charles Watkins began to understand what it felt like to be a man who was no longer traveling toward something elsewhere, because the thing he wanted was already exactly where he was standing. He was not a man who dramatized his emotions, but he was beginning to suspect that he had been wrong about what he thought his life required. He had carried the plan to Colorado the way a traveler carries a lantern, as a source of direction in the dark, and now the lantern was still in his hand, but the light from somewhere else had made it possible to see without it. He wrote to Garrett Fulton in early March and told him he would not be coming to Leadville. He was as honest as he could be in the letter without being sentimental, saying that his circumstances had changed, and that he hoped the silver operation succeeded, and that he wished Fulton well. Fulton's reply, which came back in 3 weeks, was brief and cordial, and included a line at the end that said, simply, that a man who finds a reason to stay usually has found a better reason than any reason to go, and that was worth something. Charles put this letter with the unsent letter to Clara and kept both of them. March brought its own particular weather, warm days and cold nights, the territory trembling on the edge of spring, and Charles was approaching something that he had to approach carefully, because it was a thing you only got to approach once in the right way. He talked to Hector Vega about it, because Hector was the person in the town he trusted most after Beatrice herself, and because Hector had watched the whole thing develop with the quiet amusement of a man who has been happily married for 15 years and is not surprised by the phenomenon. "You know what you want to do," Hector said. "I do," Charles said. "Then the question is when," Hector said. "The question is whether," Charles said. "She has not committed to anything specific." Hector looked at him with the expression of a man who had watched Beatrice Wainwright teach his daughter with focused personal commitment, and had also watched her hand resting in Charles's hand through the window of her house one Sunday afternoon when he had happened to be walking past. "Do not wait too long," Hector said simply. Charles thought about this for 2 weeks, which was not too long but was long enough to be certain. On a Saturday afternoon in the last week of March, when the territory was beginning to shake itself loose from winter and the creek was running high with snowmelt, and the cottonwoods along the bank were beginning to put out their first tentative green, Charles walked to Beatrice's house. She was in the garden, clearing the winter debris from her vegetable beds with focused attention, wearing her old working dress and leather gloves, and she looked up when she heard him and straightened. He had brought nothing. He had decided against rings purchased from the Sears catalog that would arrive weeks later, deciding instead that the words themselves had to come first and everything else could follow from them. "I need to talk to you," he said. She removed her gloves. "All right," she said, and she waited with the particular quality of attention that was hers alone, full and present. "I had a plan," he said, "to leave by spring. Colorado, silver mines, Garrett Fulton. It was a good plan, practically speaking. Financially reasonable, a clear path forward." "Yes," she said. "I don't want any part of that plan anymore," he said. "I haven't wanted it since somewhere around November. I've been honest with myself about this for a while, and I've been trying to figure out how to say it to you without it sounding like something it's not." "What is it not?" she asked. "It's not an impulsive thing," he said. "And it's not a desperate thing. I am not a desperate man. I am a man who has looked at his situation carefully and concluded that what he wants is very clear and very specific and is standing in a garden in Coldwater Creek, New Mexico territory, pulling dead leaves out of the soil." She did not smile, not yet. She was looking at him with the full force of that clear gaze. "I want to stay here," he said. "I want to court you properly if you'll allow it. And if things go the way I hope, I want to marry you, not right now. Not in a rush, but that is where I am pointing, and I think you deserve to know that plainly." The silence stretched out between them for a long moment, and the creek ran somewhere below them, and a pair of ravens crossed the sky above the mesa, calling to each other in their low, guttural way. "You are a plain-speaking man," she said. "I try to be," he said. "I have been thinking," she said slowly, "about what I want, quite carefully, for several months. And I have concluded that I am not the kind of woman who can be content with something small. I need a man who does not require me to be less than I am, who listens, who acts from principle rather than from habit or convention, who can look at an unjust situation and call it unjust instead of shrugging it off because challenging it is inconvenient." She paused. "I have been looking at you from all of those angles for some time, Charles Watkins, and I find that you hold up. That is either the most practical declaration of affection in recorded history," he said, "or the most honest one." "I aim for both," she said. And then she smiled, and it was the smile that transformed her face, and he stepped forward across the garden bed and took both her hands in his, and she let him. And they stood in the March afternoon light with the whole territory opening up around them, and something settled itself in Charles Watkins's chest that had never been settled there before. He courted her through April the way a man courts a woman when he is serious, with presence and consistency and attention and no performance. He was at Sunday service with her and walked her home afterward. He was at the school when the spring fundraising fair required extra hands, and he built booths and carried tables, and said nothing to make her feel that his help was conditional on appreciation. He rode with her on Saturdays along the creek road, 2 horses easy together, and they talked about the books they were both reading and about the territory's politics, which were complicated and evolving, and about what a life here together might actually look like in practical terms. She had thoughts about this, many of them which he had expected. She wanted to continue teaching. She said this directly. She had worked too hard to establish herself in the position to give it up simply because she was married, and she was aware that some communities expected this as a matter of course, the married woman stepping back from public employment, and she wanted to know where he stood on it before she stood anywhere with him. He stood firmly and without hesitation in the place where she kept teaching. He said that a woman with her mind and her skill for it would be doing the territory a disservice by stopping, and that any community that lost Beatrice Wainwright as a schoolteacher on account of a marriage license was losing something it could not replace. He said this looking directly at her and meaning every word. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Good." April turned to May. The territory bloomed in its spare desert way, the cactus putting out improbable flowers, the mesa covered in low yellow blooms after a run of rain, the air smelling of sage and wet earth and the particular fragrant green of the cottonwoods. Charles had been speaking quietly to the foreman at the rafter tea about the possibility of a more permanent arrangement, something with a future built into it rather than the seasonal work he had been doing. And the foreman, a big quiet man named Anders Larson, had said he would talk to the owner, a man named Breckenridge who ran the operation from a house outside of town and who had opinions about everything but was fair about wages. Breckenridge offered Charles a foreman-level position on the Eastern Range section, with a fixed wage and a small house on the ranch property that was not much but was structurally sound and could be made into something proper with time and effort. Charles accepted. He told Beatrice that evening over dinner at her table, which had become the place where the important conversations happened, and she listened and then asked several precise questions about the wage and the terms and the house, and when she had satisfied herself on all of these she said, "Then I think we should get married in June." He sat across from her and felt something break open in his chest in the most pleasant possible way. "June," he said. "The school term ends in late May," she said. "I would like a few weeks between the end of term and the beginning of the next obligation. We can have the ceremony at the church. I don't want anything elaborate, but I do want Reverend Marsh to do it properly with words that mean something." "All right," he said, "and I want Hector and his family there," she said, "and the Larson family from the ranch." "All right," he said again. "You are agreeing to everything very quickly," she observed. "I agree with everything you're saying," he said. She looked at him with a warmth in her eyes that she did not often expose directly, keeping it typically at a lower temperature. But now it was fully there and he saw it and felt it like sunlight coming through a window. "I have something for you," he said. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring, not from the Sears catalog but from the jeweler in Santa Fe, which Hector had helped him visit during a trading trip the previous month. It was a slender gold band with a small pale topaz stone that was almost exactly the color of the light over the mesa in the early morning, and he had chosen it because it reminded him of the territory they were both choosing to stay in. He held it across the table. She took it and looked at it for a long moment, turning it in her fingers, and her eyes were bright in a way that was new. "Charles," she said. "Will you?" he said. She put the ring on her own finger, right hand holding left, and it fit as though it had been made for her, which it had, because Hector's wife Maria had helped him measure the size by lending him one of Beatrice's gloves. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." The ceremony happened on a Saturday in mid-June of 1879, in the small church at the south end of Coldwater Creek, with Reverend Marsh presiding in the thoughtful and unhurried way that characterized everything he did, as though he understood that the words of a marriage ceremony were among the most significant words a person would ever hear spoken over them, and that they deserved to be offered without rush. Hector Vega stood as Charles's witness, solid and warm and grinning at intervals that he tried to suppress and failed to. Maria Vega and Rosario sat in the front row, Rosario wearing a bright yellow dress and holding a book in her lap because she went almost nowhere without one now. Anders Larson and his wife Margaret sat behind them, Margaret with a handkerchief that she used twice before the ceremony was half over. Several of Beatrice's students and their families filled the remainder of the small church, including a Pueblo family from outside of town, whose son had been one of Beatrice's first and most enthusiastic students, a fact that she had mentioned to Charles once with quiet pride. Beatrice came down the aisle in a dress she had made herself over the previous 4 weeks, a deep blue that suited her coloring, with her hair up and a small spray of wild desert flowers pinned into it. She walked without being escorted, which had raised a brief discussion with Reverend Marsh that she had resolved to her satisfaction by explaining calmly that she had arrived in the territory alone and stood in the territory alone, and intended to walk to her own marriage under her own power. Thank you. And Reverend Marsh, who was a man of genuine spiritual open-mindedness, had agreed. Charles watched her walk toward him down the short aisle and felt the territory itself rearrange itself around this moment, felt the whole of the preceding year condense into this one present instant, the riderless horse at the water trough, the broken wrist, the roof, the snow morning, the garden in March, all of it arriving at this point, and he understood with a clarity that was almost physical that he had not planned for any of this, but that every one of those unplanned events had been the plan. The real one, the one that had been operating beneath all of his practical calculations like a creek running underground. She took her place beside him and looked up at him with steady eyes and the small private smile that he had come to think of as the one that was specifically his, and he took her hand, and Reverend Marsh began to speak. The words were simple and old, and they meant everything they said. To have and to hold, to honor and to cherish, in sickness and health, through all the seasons that the territory could throw at them, the summer drought and the winter freeze and everything in between. Charles said the words with the full conviction of a man who has arrived somewhere and knows it. Beatrice said them in the clear, honest voice that had been reading lessons aloud in the schoolhouse on the morning he came to fix the roof, and he thought that he would hear her voice at his best and worst moments for the rest of his life, and he was grateful, enormously and quietly grateful for that. They were married under the territory sky, and then they went outside into the June afternoon, and Hector produced a bottle of very good wine from somewhere in the folds of his coat, and Maria produced enough food from baskets that had been sitting in the church entrance to constitute a proper celebration, and the afternoon went long and warm and full of laughter. The small house on the eastern section of the Rafter T was not much to begin with, 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen, and a porch that needed 2 of its boards replaced, but it had a south-facing window that let in the morning light, and a view of the mesa that made Charles catch his breath even on ordinary days. He and Beatrice spent the first weeks of their marriage making it habitable, and then making it theirs. Her books on shelves he built, her braided rug from Missouri on the floor, his tools organized in the lean-to, both of them finding the rhythms of a shared life with less friction than either of them had perhaps expected, perhaps because they had been watching each other carefully for long enough that they already knew the important things. Beatrice continued teaching, and the school board, after a brief and somewhat awkward meeting at which certain members voiced objections that she addressed with comprehensive and unanswerable logic, agreed to maintain her contract. Charles rode the Eastern Range and managed the section crew, and came home in the evenings to a lit window and a woman who was always doing something interesting, reading or writing or planning the next week's lessons, or corresponding with the Missouri State Normal School about new curriculum materials, never simply waiting, always occupied in her own right. They had an argument in August that was their first real one, about whether to buy a milk cow, of all things. Beatrice had practical reservations about the time commitment of a cow, given their combined schedules. Charles had a strong preference for fresh milk. The argument lasted 2 evenings and was resolved by Beatrice producing a set of calculations about the actual daily time required for milking and comparing it against the household budget savings, which demonstrated definitively that the cow was economically sound if managed properly between them. He bought the cow. They named her Millicent. The argument left them with a clearer understanding of how they argued, which was directly and without sustained bitterness, and they both came out of it feeling more settled rather than less. The territory had its troubles that autumn, as it always did. Cattle thieving became a point of contention between the Rafter T and a neighboring operation run by a family named Cassidy, and there were several weeks of tension that required the territorial law, in the form of a deputy based out of a town 12 miles east, to sort through with considerable patience. Charles was a reliable and steadying presence through this period, refusing to allow the situation to escalate beyond its actual dimensions, while also being clear about what the ranch's legitimate interests were. Breckenridge noticed this and said so in the blunt, praise-averse way of men who do not often give compliments, which Charles accepted and mentioned to Beatrice that evening, and she said she was not surprised at all. Hector's trading operation expanded that winter, and he began making quarterly trips south to El Paso and occasionally across the border to Juarez, and he always stopped at their house on the return leg with something from the journey, spices or fabric, or once, an extraordinary set of painted ceramic tiles that he said were made by a family in Chihuahua who had been making tiles the same way for 200 years. Maria and Beatrice had become close in the natural way of two women with strong minds and genuine mutual respect, and their friendship was the center of a small social web in Coldwater Creek that connected the Mexican families and the Anglo families, and the handful of others who existed in the complicated spaces between. And Charles understood that this web was something Beatrice had actively cultivated, because she believed the divisions were artificial and harmful. By the following spring, 1880, Beatrice was expecting their first child. She told Charles on a Sunday morning in April, standing in the garden, that she had expanded from its original 2 beds to a proper kitchen garden with 6 beds and a trellis for the climbing beans, and she told him in her characteristic way, which was to say, directly and without preamble, "I am going to have a baby in November," she said. He set down the post-hole digger he had been using to extend the garden fence. He looked at her standing in the spring light with her hands in her garden gloves, and her hair pinned up with a pencil through it from where she had been marking something on the garden plan she kept. He crossed the garden in 4 steps and took her face in both his hands very carefully, the way you take something irreplaceable, and he kissed her forehead and then her cheek and then her mouth, and she laughed against his lips. "You are pleased," she said. "I am astonished," he said, and then immediately enormously pleased, in that order. "That seems like a reasonable sequence," she said. He kept his hands on her face for a moment longer looking at her, and she met his eyes without flinching, which she never did. "Are you all right?" he asked. "How are you feeling?" "Tired in the mornings," she said, "but otherwise well. Dr. Caldwell says everything is as it should be." He took her hands and held them, gloves and all, and she looked at him with the warm, private smile. "A baby," he said, still slightly astonished. "In November," she confirmed. "So we have time to prepare. I have already made a list." He laughed. Of course she had made a list. The pregnancy progressed well. Beatrice taught through September and part of October, and the school board's concerns about her condition were met with the same comprehensive logic she applied to everything. establishing that her capacity to educate children was not diminished by the fact that she was pregnant, a point which she documented extensively and which Reverend Marsh, who sat on the board, supported. She stopped teaching in late October when travel between the house and the school became physically difficult, and she spent those last weeks reading and writing and directing Charles in the modifications she wanted made to the second room of the house, which she had planned for the nursery with the same methodical attention she brought to everything. The baby came on a Thursday night in November, with Maria Vega present as midwife, as she had attended half the births in the territory over the previous 15 years, and with Dr. Caldwell there in a supporting capacity. Charles waited in the main room in a state of barely controlled anxiety for several hours, listening to sounds from the other room that he could not interpret, and that Maria occasionally emerged to either explain or dismiss, with the calm efficiency of a woman who had seen many births and understood both their frequency and their gravity. The baby arrived in the small hours of Friday morning, November 14th, 1880, and the sound of his first cry was the sound that rearranged every remaining loose piece of Charles Watkins's inner world into a final permanent configuration. A son. 8 pounds in some, as Caldwell measured it, with dark hair and a face that was astonishingly complete and small and already unmistakably alive. Charles was allowed into the room, and he sat beside Beatrice's bed, and she put the baby into his arms with the quiet confidence of a woman who has just done something extraordinary and knows it. And he held his son, and felt the particular terror and love of a new father, which is unlike any other combination of emotions in human experience. "He is perfect," Charles said, which was what men say when what they mean is that the universe has just expanded in a direction they could not have predicted. "He is," Beatrice agreed. She was tired in a deep specific way, but her eyes were bright. "What shall we call him?" They had discussed names in a general way without arriving at any conclusion, both of them being people who preferred to see a thing before naming it. Charles looked at his son's face. "James," he said. "James Hector Watkins." Beatrice's eyes softened. "After Hector," she said. "He has been a good friend," Charles said. "The best kind, the kind you find in places you didn't expect to find anything." "James Hector Watkins," she said, trying the name, approving it. "Yes, that's right." Hector received the news the following morning when Charles rode to his door at first light, which was the kind of communication that did not require a letter. Hector stood in his doorway in his nightshirt with his eyes wide, and then his face transformed into the biggest smile Charles had ever seen on him, and he clapped Charles on both shoulders with a force that rocked him on his feet, and then went inside to tell Maria, and Maria cried, which set Rosario crying, which set Hector pretending he was not also crying. James Hector Watkins grew. This is what babies do, and he did it with a determination and a thoroughness that his mother recognized as characteristic, and his father found continuously astonishing. He was a solid, cheerful infant with his mother's eyes and his father's jaw, and he took an interest in everything from a very young age, reaching for whatever was in his vicinity with focused curiosity. Beatrice returned to teaching in January, with Rosario Vega, who was now 14 and thoroughly competent, helping with James in the mornings before her own school work, an arrangement that suited everyone and that Beatrice compensated fairly from her teacher's wage. The territory continued its evolution around them, as territories do. New Mexico was in the process of working toward statehood, which would not arrive for decades yet, but the political discussion of it rippled through communities like Coldwater Creek in ways both practical and philosophical. Charles became increasingly involved in the civic life of the town, not from ambition, but from the natural inclination of a man who takes responsibility for his surroundings seriously, attending town meetings and participating in the discussions about the road improvements and the water rights and the school funding that constituted the real ongoing work of community life in a frontier settlement. Beatrice, who could not vote, which was an injustice she noted consistently and without resignation, influenced these discussions through every avenue available to her, which, given her relationship to the education of essentially every child in the community, was considerable. She wrote letters to the territorial governor's office about school funding. She corresponded with women in the territory who were beginning to organize around the question of suffrage, which was still a distant horizon, but one she kept her eyes on. She continued teaching with undiminished commitment, and the quality of education in Coldwater Creek improved measurably and consistently under her management. The school got a new building in 1882, 2 rooms instead of 1, properly roofed and with windows that fit their frames and a wood stove that drew correctly. Charles helped build it on weekends over the course of 2 months, as did Anders Larson and Hector and several other men from the community. When the building was complete, Beatrice walked through it alone one morning before school, and Charles watched her from the doorway, watching her run her hand along the new desks and look at the blackboard that took up the full length of one wall, and her expression was the expression of a person who has worked towards something and arrived at it and found it to be real. He said nothing. Sometimes the right response to something beautiful is silence. Life built itself around them with the patient industry of a thing that intends to last. The ranch prospered. The garden expanded. James learned to walk and then to run and then to speak, and his first clear word, which arrived on a March morning just before his first birthday, was not mama or papa but the word for the milk cow, which he had been watching with fixed attention for weeks. He called her Millie, which the adults agreed was genuinely funny, and the story was told at every Vega family dinner for years afterward. A second child came in 1884. A daughter they named Clara after Charles's sister in Tennessee, with whom he had by then resumed a proper correspondence, and who had written back letters full of news from home and warm and simple happiness at his situation. Clara Watkins arrived in July, small and fierce, and opinionated from her first weeks, which pleased Beatrice considerably and caused James, who was 3, to regard his sister with the respectful caution of someone who understands that he has encountered a personality of significant force. The years settled into the full, rich texture of a life that is actually lived in the territory. Seasons turning. The mesa shifting color with the light, gold in morning, rose at dusk, silver and still in the deep winter nights. The cattle moving across the range. The school filling and emptying on its annual rhythm, the Vega house always full of noise and food and the complicated warmth of an extended family. Rosario Vega, who had learned to read under Beatrice's hand and had then devoured every book in the territory she could find, was accepted in 1885 to a teacher's training program in Santa Fe, and the evening the family received this news was one of the genuinely joyful evenings that Charles could point to as a marker of something good happening in the world. He thought sometimes, in quiet moments, about the morning the riderless horse had come to the water trough. He thought about the boy he had been at 31, still young enough in his own estimation, with his plans folded in his breast pocket and his face turned toward Colorado. He thought about the specific kind of foolishness that was not stupidity, but simply the failure of imagination, the inability to picture a future you had not yet encountered. He had not been able to imagine Beatrice Wainwright at 31 because she had not yet appeared, and the future he had planned was the future of a man who had not yet appeared to himself in his full dimensions. He had planned to leave the territory by spring, and a woman had changed every plan he had. He thought about this without any feeling of loss for the Colorado plan, which had been a good plan, and had served him well as a direction until he found a better one. He thought about it with the gratitude of a man who has been lucky in the specific way that has nothing to do with chance and everything to do with having been paying attention when the important thing arrived. Beatrice was 37 in the autumn of 1888, and Charles was 40, And they had been married for 9 years in a territory that was beginning to look less like a territory and more like the thing it was becoming. James was 8 and going to school in his mother's classroom, which presented certain diplomatic complexities that Beatrice managed with characteristic fairness, refusing to treat him with either favoritism or undue strictness, simply treating him as a student who happened to share her name. Clara was 4 and had the run of the house in the way of second children who have understood from very early on that the world is available to those who engage with it on their own terms. The Wainwright Watkins house had grown from its original 2 rooms to a proper 4-room structure with a good porch on the south side, and a barn that was larger than strictly necessary, but that Charles had built large because he had the time and the material and the professional conviction that things worth building were worth building correctly. Beatrice's garden supplied most of their kitchen vegetables and some of the herb supplies for Dr. Caldwell's practice, which she had begun providing informally after she had grown more than she and the family could use, and Caldwell had mentioned that certain things were difficult to obtain. One November evening, when the children were in bed and the stove was burning clean and the territory outside the window was all stars and silence, Charles and Beatrice sat together on the settee that had arrived by freight wagon from Santa Fe the previous summer, and she was reading and he was not quite reading, mostly looking at the fire, and she put her book down and looked at him. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "The horse," he said. She knew immediately which horse. She looked at him with an expression that was everything the years had added to her face, all the warmth and certainty, and the deep specific joy of a life that has been deliberately built. "If she hadn't thrown me," Beatrice said, "you would have ridden into town on your own," Charles said, "and I would have been sitting on that porch with my coffee. And you would have left for Colorado in the spring," she said. "Without question," he said. "So we owe Millicent's predecessor a considerable debt," she said. Millicent the cow had been deceased for 2 years, and this was a gentle callback that made Charles smile. "We do," he said. She put her head against his shoulder with the ease of something that has been done 1,000 times and still feels exactly right. He put his arm around her. "Are you happy?" he asked. It was not a question he asked often, not because he was afraid of the answer, but because in their ordinary life together the answer was present in everything she did and said, and the way she moved through their shared world. But on certain evenings he needed to hear it, in words, in her clear voice. "Profoundly," she said. "More than I knew was possible when I was a young woman in Missouri with a father who was dying and a box of books and a train ticket to the territory." She paused. "I did not imagine this then." "Neither did I," he said. "That's what makes it real," she said. "You can't imagine the best things, you can only find them." The fire settled in the stove. James made a small sound in his sleep in the other room. Clara's steady breathing was audible through the door. The territory lay around them enormous and dark and full of its own complicated life, all the stars doing what stars have always done, burning with an indifference to human plans that Charles had once found isolating and now found simply true, the way the world was, the way it had always been, offering nothing guaranteed and taking nothing back. He held his wife in the house they had built in the territory they had chosen, and outside the window the mesa stood against the stars as it would stand long after either of them was here to see it, patient and absolute and entirely unmoved by the small but genuine triumph of 2 people who had found each other in the middle of all that vast American space, and had chosen, with full knowledge of what they were choosing, to stay. In the spring of 1889, when the desert bloomed and the cottonwoods unfurled their green along the creek, and the air carried that particular freshness that the territory offered only in these weeks between winter and summer, a letter came from Charles's sister Clara in Tennessee asking whether they might come for a visit in the summer, and Charles and Beatrice sat at their kitchen table and discussed it with the seriousness they brought to all important decisions, weighing it from every angle. James said he wanted to go because he had never seen Tennessee, and his mother had told him about the green, and he wanted to see the green. Young Clara said she wanted to see her aunt, whose letters she had been hearing read aloud since she was old enough to follow the words. Beatrice said that a summer trip east would give her an opportunity to visit the normal school in Memphis that had been corresponding with her about curriculum materials. Charles said that he had not seen his sister in 11 years and that he would like to correct this. They went in July, all four of them by rail from Amarillo, the same line Charles had once planned to take north toward a different life, and they traveled east through the changing landscape with the children pressing their faces to the windows as the scrubland gave way to the red earth of Texas, and then to the thickening green of the South. And James said, somewhere in Arkansas, that the trees were enormous, and Charles said yes, that was the South, and felt something unlock in him at the sight of it. Not a regret, but a recognition. The old country of his boyhood opening its arms in the unconditional way of places you have known long and left. Clara Watkins, his sister, was 45 and had a husband named Robert and 3 children of her own, and a house outside of Nashville with a porch that wrapped 3 sides and a kitchen that smelled of everything he remembered from childhood. She wept when she saw him, and he held her with the emotion of a man who does not often display emotion publicly, but who is in the presence of something that overrides the habit. She took Beatrice by both hands and looked at her with the clear, appraising warmth of a woman who has spent 11 years reading letters about another woman and has formed opinions. I always knew, Clara said to him later, alone in the kitchen while Beatrice sat on the porch with Robert and the children, from the way you wrote about her, even before you knew yourself. The letter's that clear, he said. The first letter you wrote me, she said, after you found her in the road with the broken wrist. You spent more time describing the way she spoke to you than describing any physical characteristic. That told me everything. You might have warned me, he said. Would you have listened? She said he laughed. No, he admitted. The summer in Tennessee was everything a summer in Tennessee is. Full and warm and green and noisy with cicadas in the evenings, and it was good for all of them. Beatrice and Clara formed a friendship over those 3 weeks that would sustain itself in letters for the rest of their lives. James learned to fish in the creek behind the house and caught his first catfish with his cousin Ned's help and talked about it for weeks afterward. Young Clara discovered that she loved horses in a new and specific way after Robert's mare allowed her to sit on her back and walk in a slow circle around the yard. They returned to the territory in August, when the heat was still thick and the scrubland baked under an enormous sky, and as the train came back through the east edge of the territory and the landscape opened up into its familiar enormous self, Charles felt the particular feeling that he had not expected to feel but recognized entirely. He was coming home. The territory had done this. It had started as a place he was passing through and had become a place he was from, and that transformation, he understood, had not been the work of the land itself, but of the life he had built on it, of Beatrice, of James and Clara and the house on the eastern range section, and the school and the garden and Hector and Maria, and all of the small daily texture of a real life lived in a specific place with specific people. He looked out the train window at the mesa appearing in the distance, catching the late light, and he felt the specific peace of a man who has found his place in the world and knows it, and he did not question it or analyze it but simply held it, the way you hold something you have worked for, with both hands, without apology. Beatrice was sitting across from him, reading one of the books she had acquired in Memphis, with James asleep against her side and young Clara on the seat beside Charles, looking out the window with the large eyes of a child who is taking notes on the world. Beatrice looked up from her book and found his eyes and held them for a moment, and she smiled the small private smile that was specifically his, and he smiled back, and between them the years stretched in both directions, behind into all the history that had made them and ahead into all the future that was still to be made, and both directions were full, and both were good. The territory received them as it always did, without ceremony, without judgment, simply as it was, enormous and honest and full of difficulty and full of grace, offering nothing except the chance to make something of it, which they had, which they were still making, which they would go on making for as long as they had breath in each other, and the wide desert sky overhead on the nights when the stars came out, as they always did in their thousands, undiminished and burning. Charles Watkins had planned to leave the territory by spring, and a woman had changed every plan he had. He was glad, with every part of himself, down to his bones, down to the roots of whatever he was made of, that she had.